Elephant cries for help. What the man did next will inspire you. How will this story unfold? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. The golden sun hung low over the savannah, its warm light stretching across the horizon like a blanket of fire. The tall grass swayed gently in the breeze, rustling like whispers carried on the wind. Birds soared overhead, their calls blending into the symphony of the wild, an unbroken rhythm of life that echoed across the plains. It was beautiful, timeless, a place where nature reigned supreme. But something shattered that peace. A deep, anguished trumpet cut through the air, sharp and desperate, like the cry of a soul in pain. It echoed for miles, sending flocks of birds scattering from their perches and startling the smaller creatures hiding among the grass. The sound carried with it an urgency that pierced through the serene quiet of the savannah, demanding attention. Not far from the source of the sound, a man froze mid-step. His name was Daniel, a ranger who had spent years patrolling this land, protecting it, understanding it, and loving every inch of its beauty. The cry reached his ears like a thunderclap, loud and unmistakable. He knew that sound. An elephant. His heart leapt in his chest as his gaze shot toward the horizon, where the sun bathed everything in hues of gold and orange. Daniel had heard elephants trumpet many times before, but this was different. This wasn't the sound of a herd calling to one another or a warning cry to fend off danger. This was a call for help. Without hesitation, Daniel broke into a run. The dry earth crunched beneath his boots as he sprinted through the tall grass, his breath coming in steady bursts as adrenaline pumped through his veins. He didn't know what he would find, but there was no time to waste. The elephants of this region were his responsibility, his family in a way, and he couldn't ignore their cries. The sun dipped lower as he ran, shadows lengthening across the plains. His eyes scanned the horizon, searching desperately for movement, for any sign of the creature that had cried out. He knew elephants often wandered vast distances, and a single cry could carry for miles. If he didn't find it soon, it might be too late. After what felt like an eternity, Daniel crested a small rise and froze. There, in the distance, stood a lone elephant. Even from far away, Daniel could see its immense size, its broad back rising like a mountain above the swaying grass. The elephant's large ears flapped slowly, its trunk swinging in frantic, jerky motions. Something was wrong. Daniel swallowed hard, his pulse quickening as he picked his way down the slope, careful not to startle the animal. As he got closer, he could see the details more clearly. It was a young adult male, its powerful legs trembling under its weight. The elephant's eyes, usually so calm and knowing, were wide with fear. Then Daniel saw it. The elephant's left front leg was trapped, caught in a mess of twisted barbed wire that looked like it had been discarded and hidden beneath the grass. Daniel's chest tightened at the sight. This was the work of poachers. The wire was part of a crude snare, meant to trap smaller animals, but the elephant had wandered into it unknowingly. Now, the barbed metal bit into the soft flesh of its leg, the sharp edges digging deep enough to draw blood. The elephant let out another trumpet of pain, its body swaying dangerously as it struggled to free itself. But every movement made the wire cut deeper, and the elephant's strength was beginning to waver. Daniel's throat went dry as he took in the situation. The elephant was panicked and in pain, two things that could make even the gentlest of creatures dangerous. One wrong move and Daniel could easily be trampled. But he didn't think about that. He couldn't. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to move slowly as he stepped out from the grass and into the elephant's line of sight. "Easy now," he murmured softly, his voice low and calm. "Easy, big guy. I'm here to help you." The elephant's head shot up, its large eyes locking onto Daniel. Its trunk lifted slightly, as though testing the air, trying to decide if this approaching human was a threat. Daniel froze, his hands raised in front of him, palms open. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said gently. "I know you're scared, but I'm going to help you. I promise." The elephant let out a deep rumble, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the ground, and swayed slightly, its legs still caught in the wire. Daniel's heart ached as he watched the mighty creature struggle. He couldn't imagine the pain it was in, but he knew he had to act fast. If the elephant struggled much longer, it might injure itself further, or worse, collapse from exhaustion. Moving as carefully as possible, Daniel circled around the elephant, his eyes scanning the wire trap to assess the damage. It was a mess of tangled metal, rusted and sharp, wrapped tightly around the elephant's leg. Removing it wouldn't be easy, especially if the elephant panicked, but Daniel had no choice. Reaching into his pack, he pulled out a pair of heavy-duty wire cutters. They were worn from use but reliable, tools he'd carried with him for situations just like this. He tightened his grip on the handles, then looked up at the elephant. "I'm going to get you out of this," he said firmly. "But you need to trust me." The elephant let out another low rumble, its eyes following Daniel's every move. It didn't back away, but it didn't charge either. Daniel took that as a sign, a fragile truce between man and beast. He crouched down, his hands shaking slightly as he approached the trapped leg. The elephant flinched, its muscles tensing, but Daniel stayed calm. "It's okay," he murmured, his voice steady. "I'm just going to take a look." The wire was worse up close. It had cut deep into the elephant's thick skin, leaving raw, bloody gashes where the barbs had bitten. Daniel clenched his jaw, anger flaring in his chest at the thought of the cruelty that had caused this. Poachers had no respect for the lives they destroyed, human or animal. "Hang in there," he whispered, more to himself than the elephant. He positioned the wire cutters carefully, lining them up with a section of the trap where the wire was twisted tightly together. The metal was thick, but Daniel had faced worse. He squeezed the handles, his muscles straining as the cutters bit into the wire with a faint snap. The elephant flinched, its trunk lifting as it let out a short trumpet of alarm. Daniel froze, his heart pounding. For a moment, he thought the animal might pull away, or worse, charge, but it didn't. The elephant's eyes settled back on him, its breathing heavy but steady. "Good," Daniel said softly, relief flooding through him. "Good boy. We're almost there." He moved quickly, cutting through another section of wire and then another, each snap of the cutters making the elephant twitch slightly. Sweat dripped down Daniel's forehead, his arms shaking from the effort, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. The last section of wire was the worst. It had wrapped itself so tightly around the elephant's leg that Daniel had to pry it away just to make room for the cutters. He gritted his teeth, working carefully as the sharp metal dug into his gloves. His fingers ached, his breath coming in sharp bursts, but finally, after what felt like an eternity, the last snap echoed through the clearing. The wire fell away. Daniel sat back on his heels, his chest heaving as he dropped the cutters onto the ground. His arms felt like lead, his muscles trembling from the effort, but he didn't care. The elephant was free. The massive creature stood still for a long moment, as though unsure of what to do. Its trunk reached down, brushing against its injured leg as it tested the movement carefully. Daniel watched, holding his breath, as the elephant shifted its weight. And then, slowly, the elephant took a step. Daniel let out a shaky laugh, his heart swelling with relief as the elephant moved forward, its massive body steady and strong. Blood still dripped from the wounds on its leg, but the wire was gone. It was free. The elephant turned its head, its large eyes fixing on Daniel once more. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other, man and beast, two creatures who should have been worlds apart, sharing a moment of connection that transcended words. Daniel swallowed hard, his voice hoarse as he whispered, "You're okay now. You're free." The elephant lifted its trunk slightly, the tip curling toward Daniel in a gesture that felt almost grateful. Daniel froze, his breath catching in his throat. The elephant's massive body loomed over him, its strength undeniable, but there was no fear in Daniel's heart. "Only you. Go on," he said softly. "You're safe now." The elephant lingered for a moment longer, its trunk swaying gently in the air, before it turned and began to walk away. Each step was slow and deliberate, the deep prints it left in the earth a reminder of the power and grace that defined it. Daniel watched until the elephant's massive form disappeared into the distance, the sun sinking low behind it. And as he stood there, alone in the clearing, Daniel felt something shift inside him, a realization that the small choices we make, the moments where we choose to act with kindness and courage, are the ones that matter most. Daniel remained standing in the quiet clearing, the weight of the moment sinking into him. The elephant's departure left an almost tangible silence behind, as though the world itself was pausing to take in what had just happened. His fingers ached, and his body trembled with exhaustion, but his heart was light, filled with awe and relief. He wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand, his eyes lingering on the flattened grass where the elephant had stood. For a moment, Daniel couldn't move. What had just transpired felt bigger than him, bigger than any one man. A creature of immense strength and size, with the power to destroy without trying, had trusted him enough to let him help. And Daniel knew that such trust was rare, even in a place as wild and untouched as the savannah. Taking a deep breath, he finally pulled himself to his feet and gathered his tools. He couldn't stay here long. Night was coming quickly, and the last thing he needed was to be stranded in the open when predators began to stir. The lions would be hunting soon, and the safety of his base camp was miles away. With one last look toward the direction the elephant had gone, Daniel turned and began the long trek back. The walk was slow, the sun now nothing more than a sliver of gold on the horizon. Darkness crept in like a blanket being pulled over the land, and the sounds of the savannah shifted. Birds fell silent, replaced by the howls of distant hyenas and the occasional growl of a lion staking its claim on the night. Daniel kept his pace steady, though every sound put him on edge. He was no stranger to the dangers of the wild, but the quiet hours after sunset always carried an extra weight, an unease that even seasoned rangers like him couldn't shake. As he walked, his mind returned to the elephant. He could still hear its trumpet in his ears, still see the fear in its wide, intelligent eyes. He thought of the moment the wire had finally fallen away, of the gentle gesture the elephant had made with its trunk. A thank you, he was sure of it. What a day, he murmured to himself, his voice barely more than a whisper. The wind picked up, brushing through the tall grass around him and sending ripples across the land. Daniel adjusted his pack on his shoulders and pushed forward, his boots crunching against the dry earth. By the time Daniel reached camp, the stars were out in full force, shimmering like diamonds scattered across an endless black sky. The camp itself was small and rugged, little more than a cluster of canvas tents and a fire pit surrounded by a few wooden benches. Daniel could see the glow of a fire flickering through the trees as he approached, the faint scent of smoke drifting on the breeze. A sense of relief washed over him as he stepped into clearing, where two of his colleagues, David and Ann, were sitting near the fire. David noticed him first, his brow furrowing as he stood. "Daniel, you're back late. What happened out there?" In turn two, her face creased with concern as she saw the dirt and sweat streaked across Daniel's clothes. "Are you okay?" Daniel dropped his pack on the ground and let out a long breath. "Yeah, I'm okay. But you're not going to believe what I just did." David exchanged a look with, and before gesturing for Daniel to sit. "We've got time. Tell us." Daniel settled onto one of the benches, his muscles aching with every movement. The fire crackled softly, casting warm light across their faces as he began to speak. "There was an elephant," he said, his voice soft at first. "It was trapped, caught in a barbed wire snare. I heard its cries and went to find it." Ann's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes widening. "A snare? Poachers?" Daniel nodded grimly. "That's my guess. Probably set for smaller animals, but the elephant got caught. The wire was wrapped tight around its leg, so tight it was cutting into the skin." He shook his head, the memory still fresh. "It was in pain, but it let me help. It trusted me." David leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "You mean you got close enough to cut it free?" "Close enough to touch it," Daniel said, faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "I thought it might panic, might charge, but it didn't. It just stood there, watching me, waiting. I worked for what felt like hours cutting that wire, and when it was finally free, it looked at me like," he paused, searching for the right words, "like it understood." The fire crackled, the silence stretching as Ann and David stared at him in disbelief. And broke the silence first, her voice soft. "That's incredible." Daniel nodded slowly. "It was. I don't know how to describe it, but in that moment, it felt like something more. Like it wasn't just about saving an animal. It was about trust, about connection. That elephant knew I was trying to help it." David let out a low whistle, leaning back on his bench. "You're lucky it didn't crush you. A wild elephant could have flattened you in seconds." "I know," Daniel replied, "but it didn't. That's what makes it so amazing." And smiled faintly, her gaze fixed on the fire as she spoke. "It's moments like that that remind us why we do this, isn't it? Why we fight to protect them." Daniel nodded. "Yeah, it's easy to get caught up in the work, in the routine of it all. But today was different." He stared into the fire, the flames dancing in his eyes as his mind drifted back to the elephant. The way it had looked at him, the way it had lingered after being freed, it was something he would never forget. "I just hope it's okay," he said quietly. "That leg was in bad shape. It'll need time to heal." "It will," Ann said firmly. Elephants are resilient creatures. You gave it a chance, Daniel. That's more than most would have done. Daniel didn't respond. He just nodded, his heart heavy with the weight of the day, but lightened by the knowledge that he had made a difference. The next morning, Daniel woke with the first light of dawn, the cool air carrying the fresh scent of dew and earth. The events of the previous day played through his mind as he sat up, stretching his sore muscles. He could still see the elephant's eyes, still hear the snap of the wire as it fell away. A sense of unfinished business tugged at him as he pulled on his boots and grabbed his pack. He needed to check on the elephant to make sure it had made it through the night. He knew it was risky, tracking a wild animal always was, but he couldn't ignore the feeling that pulled him back to that clearing. David and Ann were still asleep as Daniel slipped out of camp, the first rays of sunlight spilling over the horizon. He moved quickly, retracing his steps from the previous evening. The grass was damp beneath his boots, and the morning air was alive with the sounds of birds greeting the day. As he reached the rise overlooking the clearing, Daniel's heart leapt. The elephant was there. It stood near the edge of the clearing, its massive body silhouetted against the rising sun. Its trunk swayed gently as it grazed on the tall grass, and though its movements were slow, they were steady. The leg that had been trapped still looked raw and wounded, but the elephant seemed stronger today, more sure of itself. Daniel exhaled a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Relief flooded through him as he watched the mighty creature, alive and free. The elephant lifted its head, its large eyes turning toward Daniel as though sensing his presence. For a long moment, they stared at each other across the clearing, two beings separated by species, yet bound by a moment of trust and understanding. The elephant raised its trunk, the tip curling slightly as it let out a soft, rumbling sound. Daniel smiled, his heart full. "Good to see you too," he whispered. He didn't step closer. He didn't need to. The elephant lingered for a moment longer before turning and walking slowly toward the open savanna, its powerful form bathed in the golden light of dawn. Daniel watched until it disappeared into the horizon, a sense of peace settling over him. Sometimes, the smallest actions carried the greatest meaning, and sometimes trust, however fragile, was enough to bridge the gap between worlds. The elephant disappeared into the vast horizon, its massive silhouette growing smaller with each step until it finally melted into the golden light of the morning savanna. Daniel stood motionless, his heart full, his breath steady. The moment felt surreal, like something from a dream, and yet it was as real as the dirt beneath his boots. For a long time, Daniel stayed where he was, staring at the empty clearing. He'd seen elephants many times before, herds moving gracefully across the plains, mothers tending to their calves, bulls standing their ground with quiet power, but this was different. This single elephant had shown him something more, something deeper. It had trusted him. It was a trust he knew he didn't deserve, but it humbled him all the same. As the wind whispered through the grass, Daniel thought back to the day he had first stepped onto this land. Years ago, he had arrived as a new recruit, fresh out of training, his heart full of dreams and his mind full of ideals. He had wanted to save the world, to make a difference. Back then, he hadn't fully understood the complexities of this place, the struggles of conservation, the ruthless hand of poaching, or the delicate balance of nature. Over time, the savanna had taught him its lessons, both beautiful and cruel. He had seen the majesty of life, wildebeests thundering across the plains, lion cubs playing in the safety of their pride, elephants moving like kings across the land. But he had also seen the heartbreak, animals left to suffer in snares, rhinos slaughtered for their horns, and ecosystems devastated by human greed. Sometimes it felt like the fight was too big, too hopeless. But today, standing in this clearing where a single elephant had been freed, Daniel was reminded why he stayed. One small act could make a difference. One moment of compassion, one effort to help, could change everything, for an animal, for the land, and for himself. The walk back to camp felt lighter this time. The sun had fully risen, bathing the world in a golden glow. Daniel's boots crunched through the grass as he moved, the sound of the savanna waking up all around him. Birds flitted from branch to branch, zebras grazed in the distance, and somewhere far off, the low rumble of elephants could be heard. The sound brought a smile to Daniel's face. When he reached camp, Ann and David were sitting by the fire, mugs of coffee steaming in their hands. David looked up as Daniel appeared, his eyebrows lifting in surprise. "You're up early," David said, taking a sip from his mug. "Didn't think you'd be up for another hike after yesterday." Daniel dropped his pack next to the bench and sat down, stretching his tired legs. I had to check on him. Him? And asked, her face lighting up with curiosity. The elephant, Daniel replied. I wanted to make sure he was okay. And Daniel smiled faintly, the memory of the elephant's slow, steady walk still fresh in his mind. He's fine. He was grazing when I found him. The leg's still sore, but he's strong. He'll be okay. And let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. That's good to hear. David shook his head, a smirk playing on his lips. You got a soft spot for those giants, don't you? Daniel chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. They deserve it. They're incredible animals, smart, strong, and gentle. It's hard not to feel something when you're standing in front of one. And nodded thoughtfully, her gaze drifting toward the horizon. They say elephants never forget. Maybe that one won't forget you. The thought made Daniel pause. He hadn't considered it, but the idea stirred something deep inside him. Elephants were known for their remarkable memory, their ability to recognize faces, places, and even the humans they encountered. Could the elephant remember him? Would it carry that moment of trust with it, the same way Daniel would carry it forever? I hope not, he said quietly. Over the next few weeks, life on the savannah carried on as usual. Daniel and the other rangers went about their work patrolling the land, monitoring herds, and repairing fences where needed. Every morning, Daniel woke before sunrise, the familiar routine grounding him in a place that had become his home. But no matter where his work took him, he couldn't stop thinking about the elephant. Whenever he heard a distant trumpet echo across the plains, he would pause, his heart leaping as he scanned the horizon. Whenever he spotted a herd grazing near the watering holes, he found himself searching for the familiar face of the elephant he had freed. He knew it was unlikely. Elephants traveled vast distances, and there were hundreds across the region, but still he hoped. And then, one day, it happened. The sun hung high in the sky, its heat baking the earth and turning the air thick with dust. Daniel and Anne were driving through one of the reserve's remote trails, their open-top Jeep bouncing over uneven ground as they scanned the horizon for signs of movement. Anything? Daniel asked, squinting against the glare, and shook her head, lowering her binoculars. Just zebras. Looks like a few wildebeest, too, but nothing unusual. Daniel sighed, adjusting his grip on the steering wheel. The dry season had driven many animals toward the larger watering holes, leaving this part of the reserve quieter than usual. Let's keep going, he said, turning the wheel and guiding the Jeep toward the edge of the tree line. They drove in silence for a while, the hum of the engine blending with the sounds of the savannah. Then, and let out a sharp gasp, grabbing Daniel's arm. Stop. Look. Daniel hit the brakes, the Jeep skidding to a halt as he followed his pointing finger. At first, he didn't see anything. The grass was tall, and the glare of the sun made it hard to focus. But then, from the edge of the tree line, something moved. A massive figure stepped into view. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. It was the elephant. Even from this distance, Daniel recognized it instantly. The broad, powerful shape of its body, the slightly uneven sway of its steps as it moved across the grass. Its left leg still bore the faint scars from where the wire had cut into it, though the wounds had healed over into dark, rugged lines. Daniel felt a lump form in his throat as he watched the elephant move, its trunk swaying gently as it grazed. It looked healthy, strong, a testament to the resilience of a creature that had fought through pain and fear to reclaim its freedom. It's him, Daniel said softly, almost to himself, and lowered her binoculars, her face breaking into a smile. That's incredible. He looks good. Daniel nodded, unable to tear his eyes away. The elephant turned its head slightly, as though sensing their presence, and for a moment, its gaze seemed to lock onto Daniel. It's like he knows you're here, and said, her voice full of wonder. Daniel didn't respond. He couldn't. His heart was too full, his mind spinning with the sheer improbability of this moment. After weeks of searching, after countless days spent hoping, the elephant had appeared, as though to show him that it was okay. The elephant lifted its trunk, the tip curling slightly as it let out a low, deep rumble that carried across the clearing. Daniel felt the sound in his chest, its resonance so familiar that it brought him back to that first day in the clearing, when the wire had fallen away and trust had bridged the impossible gap between man and beast. Thank you, Daniel whispered, the words carried away on the breeze. The elephant lingered for another moment before turning, its massive body disappearing back into the tree line. Its footsteps were slow and deliberate, each step leaving deep imprints in the earth. As the last of its form faded into the shadows, Daniel let out a long breath, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, and was silent beside him, her eyes still fixed on the spot where the elephant had been. "Do you think he really remembered you?" she asked softly. Daniel smiled faintly, his gaze still locked on the horizon. "I don't know, but I'll remember him." And that, he thought, was enough. Daniel's hands were steady on the wheel, but his mind was still lingering on the elephant. For as long as he could remember, he had known these creatures were remarkable, intelligent, emotional beings with a connection to the world that often seemed deeper than what most people could comprehend. But this was different. This was personal. As the Jeep rumbled along the trail and sat quietly beside him, lost in her own thoughts, neither of them felt the need to speak. The savannah stretched out around them, vast and golden under the afternoon sun, but Daniel's gaze kept flicking to the tree line where the elephant had disappeared. He couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter had meant something, that somehow the animal had come back to show him it was okay. Hours passed as they drove the remote trails, stopping occasionally to check on watering holes or document the tracks of other animals. But even as the day wore on, the memory of the elephant stayed with him like a shadow. Every so often, a breeze would rustle the grass or a distant trumpet would echo across the plains, and Daniel's heart would leap, thinking maybe, just maybe, it was him again. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and violet, Daniel guided the Jeep back toward camp. The air had cooled slightly, the oppressive heat of the day giving way to the soft caress of evening. It was one of those rare moments when the world felt perfectly still, like the land itself was holding its breath, and turned to him suddenly, breaking the silence. "Do you think he's still out there?" "The elephant?" Daniel smiled faintly, keeping his eyes on the road. "I think he's exactly where he wants to be." She nodded, as though that answer satisfied something within her. "It's funny. I spent years studying elephants, and I've seen how they act around their families, their herds. But what you experience, that's different. It's rare. It's humbling," Daniel said quietly, "to have a creature like that trust you. To have it let you help." And tilted her head thoughtfully. "You don't think he's following you, do you?" Daniel laughed softly. "If he is, he's doing a good job staying hidden." They both fell silent again, the Jeep bouncing gently over the uneven ground as they neared the camp. Daniel felt a strange mix of emotions, gratitude, wonder, and a hint of longing. He hadn't expected the encounter to affect him so deeply, but it had. It had left a mark, a quiet realization that the world was full of connections waiting to be made, connections that defied logic, that defied the lines humans had drawn between themselves and the wild. Back at camp, the fire was already lit, the familiar glow flickering in the growing darkness. David was tending to it, stirring a pot of stew that bubbled gently over the flames. He looked up as the Jeep approached, raising a hand in greeting. "You two are cutting it close," David called out. "Thought you'd get stuck out there for the night," and hopped out of the Jeep, brushing dust from her pants. "We're here, aren't we?" Daniel followed her, his muscles aching as he stretched his legs. The smell of the stew hit him, and his stomach growled in response. He hadn't realized how hungry he was. "You look like you've seen a ghost," David said, eyeing Daniel with mild amusement. "Another elephant encounter, maybe?" Daniel chuckled, shaking his head. "Nothing like that. Just a quiet day." David grunted, stirring the pot with a wooden spoon. "Quiet's not a bad thing around here. You'll miss it when it's gone," and sat down on one of the benches, leaning back and gazing up at the stars that had begun to appear in the darkening sky. "You know," she said softly, "I read once that elephants grieve the way we do. They mourn their dead. They remember places where they felt safe. They even recognize people they haven't seen in years." Daniel lowered himself onto the bench across from her, the firelight casting warm shadows across his face. "I believe it. Maybe that's what makes them so incredible," and continued. "They're more like us than we think. They just live differently." Daniel looked up at the stars, his thoughts drifting back to the elephant. He wondered where it was now, whether it had rejoined a herd or was still wandering alone. Wherever it was, he hoped it was safe. David ladled the stew into bowls, passing one to each of them. The three of them ate in silence, the crackling of the fire and the hum of the savannah their only soundtrack. It was a simple meal, but it tasted better than anything Daniel could remember. When they were finished and stood and stretched, letting out a long sigh. I'm calling it a night. Tomorrow's going to be another long one. David nodded, tossing another log onto the fire. Same here. Don't let the lions get you, Daniel. Daniel grinned faintly, shaking his head. I'll try. And then David disappeared into their tents, leaving Daniel alone by the fire. He stared into the flames, watching as they danced and crackled, sending embers spiraling into the cool night air. The stars above were brighter now, scattered like tiny sparks of light across the endless sky. Daniel leaned back, his gaze drifting upward. He thought of the elephant again, of the way it had looked at him, the trust in its deep, knowing eyes. He didn't know if he'd ever see it again, but that didn't matter. The bond they'd shared, however brief, had changed something inside him. It was a reminder that the world was full of moments like this, moments that reminded him why he was here, why he did this work. As the fire began to die down, Daniel stood and stretched, letting the cool night air wash over him. He turned toward his tent, ready to call it a night, but as he did, something stopped him. A sound, faint at first, carried on the wind, but unmistakable. It was a low, deep rumble, the kind that vibrated through the ground and settled in the chest. Daniel froze, his breath catching as he turned toward the dark horizon. He couldn't see anything, but he knew that sound. The elephant. His heart began to pound, a mix of excitement and disbelief coursing through him as he stepped closer to the edge of camp. He stared out into the darkness, his eyes straining to see, but the night held its secrets well. The rumble came again, slightly closer this time, and Daniel felt his pulse quicken. He didn't know why the elephant had come, or how it had found him, but it didn't matter. Somehow, in the vastness of the savannah, it had returned. Daniel smiled, a quiet, knowing smile that no one else would see. "Good night, big guy," he whispered into the darkness. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed faintly through the night, growing softer and softer until they disappeared completely. Daniel stood there for a moment longer, his heart full, before turning and heading toward his tent. As he settled into his cot, the faint rumble of the elephant's call still echoed in his mind like a distant lullaby. It was a reminder that they were not so different, after all, man and beast, separated by species but connected by something deeper. Trust. The night was still and quiet, save for the distant sound of the savannah humming with life. Inside his tent, Daniel lay awake, his eyes fixed on the canvas ceiling above him. The faint rumble of the elephant's call still echoed in his mind, lingering like a song he couldn't shake. It had been so faint, so fleeting, but he knew it was real. It wasn't just a sound. It was a message. Sleep eluded him as he replayed the day's events in his head. The elephant appearing from the shadows, its deep eyes finding him with that knowing gaze. The gentle curl of its trunk as it rumbled softly, as though acknowledging the bond they'd shared. It felt deliberate, almost intentional, as if the elephant had come to remind him of something he already knew. Daniel sat up slowly, the cool air brushing against his face as he pushed back the thin blanket. The fire outside had burned down to embers, casting faint shadows through the tent flap. He glanced at his watch, just after midnight. The camp was silent, his colleagues fast asleep in their tents. But Daniel couldn't stay here. Not now. Grabbing his boots, he slipped them on quietly and stepped outside. The night was clear, the stars blazing bright across the endless sky, and the cool breeze carried with it the earthy scent of the savannah. Daniel took a deep breath, letting the quiet calm his racing mind. And then he heard it again. The rumble. Low, deep, and unmistakable. It vibrated through the air like a heartbeat, steady and strong. It was closer now, no longer a faint whisper on the wind. Daniel's pulse quickened as he turned toward the sound, his eyes scanning the darkness. The shadows at the edge of camp seemed to shift, and from the blackness, a shape emerged. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. It was the elephant. Even in the faint starlight, Daniel could see its massive form moving silently across the grass, its every step deliberate and careful. The scars on its leg were faintly visible, the reminders of their shared past, but the elephant moved with strength and purpose now, no longer burdened by pain. Daniel took a cautious step forward, his movement slow and gentle. "You came back," he whispered, as though speaking too loudly might scare the moment away. The elephant stopped a few feet away, its deep yellow eyes meeting his. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other, two beings from different worlds, standing together under the vast expanse of stars. There was no fear in the elephant's gaze, no hesitation. Only trust. Daniel swallowed hard, his voice trembling as he spoke. What are you doing here, big guy? The elephant let out a low, soft rumble, its trunk swaying gently as it stepped closer. Daniel stayed perfectly still, his heart pounding in his chest as the massive creature lowered its head, bringing its face level with his. The air between them was still, thick with something unspoken but deeply understood. The elephant's trunk reached out slowly, curling gently toward Daniel. For a split second, Daniel hesitated, but then he lifted his hand, his fingers brushing against the rough, warm skin of the elephant's trunk. It was a gesture of connection, of recognition, man and beast, predator and protector, sharing a bond that defied everything Daniel had ever known. Daniel's eyes burned with unshed tears as he stood there, his hand resting against the elephant's trunk. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice hoarse, "for trusting me." The elephant huffed softly, its breath warm against Daniel's face. It lingered for a moment longer, as though committing the moment to memory, before it slowly pulled its trunk back. Daniel lowered his hand, watching as the elephant straightened to its full, towering height. The stars seemed to shimmer brighter as the elephant turned, its massive form disappearing into the darkness as quietly as it had come. Daniel stood rooted to the spot, his chest heavy with emotion, his heart full. He didn't know why the elephant had returned, whether it had come to say goodbye or to remind him of the connection they shared. But in that moment, Daniel knew it didn't matter. What mattered was that it had happened. That trust, however fragile, had been enough to bridge the gap between two worlds. The next morning, Daniel woke just before sunrise. The air was crisp and cool, the first rays of light spilling over the horizon as the savannah began to stir. Birds sang their morning songs, and the distant rumble of herds echoed softly across the plains. Daniel stepped out of his tent, his mind still lingering on the night before. He hadn't told Ann or David about the elephant's visit, not yet. It felt too personal, too sacred to share. Instead, he quietly packed his gear and grabbed a steaming mug of coffee, settling himself near the fire as the camp slowly came to life, and joined him a few minutes later, yawning as she poured herself a cup. She sat across from him, her sharp eyes studying his face. "You're up early," she said, breaking the silence. Daniel smiled faintly, staring into his mug. "Couldn't sleep?" And arched an eyebrow. "Still thinking about the elephant?" Daniel looked up at her, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Always." She nodded, sipping her coffee as the fire crackled between them. "It's funny, isn't it? How moments like that can change everything. You come out here expecting one thing, and then something happens that shifts your entire perspective." Daniel's smile grew, and he glanced toward the horizon, where the sun was beginning to rise in earnest. "Yeah, it's humbling," and followed his gaze, her expression thoughtful. "Do you think he'll come back again?" Daniel didn't answer right away. Instead, he watched as the sunlight bathed the savannah in gold, painting the grass and trees in a light that felt almost magical. Somewhere out there, he knew the elephant was walking, moving with the quiet strength and grace that defined its kind. "Maybe," Daniel said finally. "But even if he doesn't, that's okay." And tilted her head, curiosity sparking in her eyes. "Why?" Daniel turned to her, his gaze steady. "Because I'll remember him." And that, he thought, was enough. As the days turned into weeks, Daniel's work continued as usual, but he carried the memory of the elephant with him wherever he went. Every time he stood at the edge of the tree line or gazed across the vast plains, he found himself searching, not with desperation, but with quiet hope. Sometimes he thought he heard the faint rumble of an elephant's call drifting on a wind, and his heart would leap, though he never saw it again. But that was the beauty of it, Daniel realized. Life on the savannah was full of moments like this, brief, fleeting connections that left their mark forever. He knew he couldn't save every animal, couldn't fix every problem, but he could act. He could try. And sometimes trying was enough. The elephant had shown him that. One small act of compassion could make a difference. One moment of trust could change everything. And as long as he carried that lesson with him, he knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. Daniel stood at the edge of the watering hole one evening, the sky painted in brilliant hues of pink and gold as the sun dipped below the horizon. The world was quiet, save for the gentle splash of animals drinking nearby and the distant calls of birds returning to their nests. He closed his eyes and listened, the familiar hum of the savannah wrapping around him like an old friend. And then, far off in the distance, he heard it. A deep, low rumble. It was faint, almost hidden beneath the other sounds of the wild, but Daniel knew it instantly. His lips curved into a soft smile as he opened his eyes, gazing toward the horizon. "Good night, big eye," he whispered. The rumble faded, but its echo lingered in his heart, a quiet reminder of a bond that would never be forgotten. And as the stars began to appear, scattered like diamonds across the darkening sky, Daniel stood there for a moment longer, grateful, at peace, and forever changed.